Welcome back. Now, I'm going to tell you about probably one of the most common errors that I encounter on a regular basis. And it's not an error per se, but it's a really frustrating thing. And it's the worst thing that can happen with open source software. That something changes and you're not always aware that there is a big release change until after the event. And I'll show you what I mean. So here we have a regular setup from my point of view. I have a perfectly good working DSC configuration, which I use in my lab all of the time. And I go ahead and I run the configuration, and there it was going, yay, cool, I'll just spin up a new machine, and then you see we have error messages, and I'm going, okay, something has changed. Now, obviously, since I knew it was a working config, the only thing that makes sense here is that in between the versions, since I always download the latest, something had changed. So in particular relation to my DHCP scope, and since the example here we're talking about is DHCP, you can kind of figure where this is going. So I did what I always do under these circumstances. I looked at the error message and said, okay, well, it's clearly not getting what it wants. Let's go have a look at the file. So that's pretty easy. It's the default location because I installed it as admin, so it's going to be down in the program files. It's going to be underneath the PowerShell modules within that. So we can just go find it and open it up and see what we have. Now, the first thing that crossed my mind when I opened this up earlier was that actually the naming convention changed. So I was like, okay, it's no longer X, it's actually DHCP for this particular module. And then we go ahead and open it up, and what I'm looking for is you've got the get and you've got the set. So we've got the get one here, so we're going to scroll down a little bit and find the set to see what parameters set is looking for. So set, you see here, has these lists of parameters, and they're set for mandatory, and they're also using ID fields, which at the time I was like, okay, what's with the ID fields? So after a little bit more exploring through the code, it kind of began to make sense. So where previously we had the example of having scope IDs and then the values set directly, we're actually now using the IDs directly from DHCP, and I'll show you exactly what I mean here. So if I open up the DHCP console a second for comparison, fortunately we have DHCP already installed, so I am able to show you basically the exact example. So if we go to the scoping options, and we just go ahead and open that up, and I'll need to create or configure here just to show you because we don't currently have anything set. And we have these ID numbers. So if you've got a router, then it's 3. If you've got name servers, it's 6. If you've got a DNS name, it's like 15, etc., etc. So if you want to set any scope options, this is what it's looking for. It's actually looking for the scope ID, then the value, which would be under that scope ID. So after a little bit of digging around, I went, okay, well, that's fine. And we changed the config file. So the rest remains the same, so it's just quite a big file, but we now have these options specified out. So we have like an option ID. So the first part stays the same. So that's the actual scope creation. And then the scope value options underneath. So in this case, we have things like, okay, we're going to go ahead and set the default gateway, we're going to go ahead and set the router address, we're going to go ahead and set the DNS. So all these kind of things. And each one has an ID. So we have the ID here of that particular item. So the default gateway, which is 3. We have the DNS, and we have the scope. So what we've got here is the value represents the default gateway, and the scope ID equals the scope ID from the previous field. Now we have 6. This is the DNS. We have our 2 entries. And again, last here, we have also our domain name. So our value is our domain name, and the scope ID is 15. Oh, sorry, option ID rather is 15, and the scope is the previous mentioned. So just like before, I'm now going to run this. I'll just clear the screen, paste it all in, hit the run, wait for it to run. This shouldn't take too long. And I can understand why they changed it, because it actually gives a little bit more rationale in terms of how to control it. It's easier from the coding perspective. Adds a few more lines to your config, to be perfectly honest, but I guess we can live with that. And Here, if we look at the result, we can now go back into the DHCP. We can go have a look at it. And if we look at this particular scope, I'm just going to open it up and go in. So many clicks. This is why we like to do things by code. And there we go. All of our scope options have been configured. And that's how easy it is. But it's something to keep in mind that when something like this changes, it's easy to just go into the file and find out what has changed rather than trying to mess around. So here's an example. The ID options and then the values in are the main category. Everything else, not really that important. The vendor IDs and vendor user classes, these are things that you can use more with something like IP telephony, and they're not really used. So in most cases, they're just empty. And that concludes today's lesson.